The year was 1960. Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister, the Beatles were still playing the Cavern Club, and most people's idea of monsters came from Hammer horror films. But for one man, the idea of a real monster living in a Scottish loch was about to become an obsession that would define the rest of his life. Timothy Kenneth Dinsdale was not the sort of man you'd expect to chase monsters. A 36-year-old aeronautical engineer from Reading, he was methodical, analytical, and thoroughly grounded in the practical world of aviation technology. He worked for a respectable firm, had a wife and 4 children, and seemed destined for a quiet life of suburban respectability. But sometimes, the most unlikely journeys begin with the most ordinary moments. Dinsdale was browsing an article in Everybody's magazine from the 21st February 1959, the day I saw the Loch Ness Monster. Most people would have glanced at it with mild amusement and moved on. Tim Dinsdale couldn't stop reading. The article fascinated him, not because he believed it, but because he didn't. Here was an engineer's mind confronted with what seemed like an engineering impossibility. Could there really be large, unknown animals living in a Scottish loch? His analytical nature demanded investigation. Dinsdale sought out every piece of literature he could find on the subject. The book that truly captured his attention was More Than a Legend by Constance Whyte, published in 1957. Whyte wasn't a sensationalist or a tabloid journalist. She was a respected local resident who had spent years carefully collecting eyewitness accounts from people she knew and trusted. As Dinsdale read through Whyte's methodical documentation of sightings, something shifted in his thinking. These weren't wild tales told by publicity seekers. These were sober accounts from doctors, teachers, hotel keepers, and long-time Highland residents, people with reputations to protect and nothing to gain from fabricating stories. By early 1960, Dinsdale had made his decision. He would travel to Loch Ness, not as a believer, but as an investigator. If there was nothing there, his engineering training would help him prove it conclusively. If there was something, well, that would require investigation too. His first trip to Loch Ness was in April 1960. Like any good researcher, Dinsdale didn't simply arrive and start scanning the water. He sought out the key witnesses, the people whose accounts had been documented in Whyte's book. His first visit was to Constance Whyte herself. Mrs. Whyte lived in a house overlooking the loch, and she received the earnest young engineer with the patience of someone who had fielded many such inquiries. But Dinsdale's questions were different. Technical, precise, focused on details that most visitors overlooked. Whyte was impressed by Dinsdale's systematic approach. Here was someone who understood the importance of credible witnesses and corroborated evidence. She shared not just the stories from her book, but the additional details that hadn't made it into print, the small observations that lent authenticity to the accounts. Next, Dinsdale sought out Alex Campbell, the water bailiff, whose report had sparked the modern monster phenomenon back in 1933. Campbell had spent more time on Loch Ness than perhaps any living person, and his knowledge of the loch's depths, currents, and wildlife was encyclopedic. Campbell received Dinsdale with the cautious respect that Highland folk reserve for serious inquirers. The bailiff had seen too many sensation seekers over the years, but he recognized in this young engineer someone genuinely interested in the truth. Campbell shared his own sightings. Yes, there had been more than one, and his theories about what might be living in the loch's depths. Dinsdale also met with Hugh, whose 1933 photograph was the first alleged image of the monster. Gray was a quiet man, still somewhat bewildered by the attention his photograph had received. He walked Dinsdale to the exact spot where he'd taken the famous picture, describing in detail what he'd seen and why he'd decided to take the photograph. Looking at Gray's blurry image, Dinsdale's engineer's eye noted both its limitations and its possibilities. The photograph proved nothing conclusively, but it didn't disprove anything either. It was, in scientific terms, intriguing data that required further investigation. After several days of interviews and reconnaissance, Dinsdale had developed a comprehensive understanding of the loch and the phenomenon. His engineering background helped him appreciate the challenges of observation. The loch's 23-mile length, its maximum depth of over 700 feet, the way mist and light could play tricks on even experienced observers. But he'd also developed something else, a growing conviction that these witnesses were describing real encounters with something genuinely unknown. For his surveillance attempts, Dinsdale chose his positions carefully. He studied the loch's geography, noting where sightings had been most frequently reported, where the deepest water lay closest to shore, and where he could achieve the best vantage points for observation and filming. Day after day, Dinsdale maintained his vigil. He had brought his 16mm Bolex camera, a reliable piece of equipment he knew well from his work in aviation. The camera sat ready in place of the passenger seat of his 1950s Austin Anglia, loaded with color film and set for rapid deployment. This setup would later prove crucial to understanding what happened next. The camera's position on the car seat meant that when Dinsdale filmed, he was shooting through his car window, a detail that many later analysts would overlook, but which significantly affected the optical quality of the footage. April 23rd, 1960, dawned misty and still. Dinsdale had positioned himself at a vantage point on the south shore, near Foyers, with a clear view across the loch toward the opposite bank. He'd been watching for hours when, at approximately 8:50 a.m., something caught his eye.
Oh, this immense, extraordinary object looked like the back of a huge animal, reddish-brown. It stood 2 or 3 feet out of the water, 4 or 5 feet across, probably nearly as long as this boat, quite motionless, reddish-brown, and a blotch on the left flank, which I could see very clearly. And then, while I was watching, it started to move. A most electrifying moment. This huge thing started to surge away across the water. And I turned to the camera, and I shot about 40 feet of black and white film at extreme range, but nevertheless it was on film. This hump going across the water made a huge glassy wake, no prop wash visible, and then it approached the far shore, and then turned through 90 degrees and progressed under the surface, throwing up a wave which has since been measured on the film at a height of about 2 feet.
It wasn't behaving like a boat. There was no engine noise carrying across the water, no visible superstructure. It was moving too smoothly, too steadily to be debris or a swimming animal. In Dinsdale's own words, I dropped the binoculars and turned to the camera, and with icy control started to film, pressing the button, firing long, steady bursts of film like a machine gunner, stopping between to wind the clockwork motor. I could see the monster through the optical camera sight, making it very clear indeed. And as it swam across the loch, it changed course, leaving a glassy zigzag wake, and then it slowly began to submerge. For approximately 1 minute, Dinsdale captured what would become the most analysed piece of monster footage ever recorded. The object moved steadily across his field of view, maintaining what appeared to be a consistent speed and direction. Then, as he watched, it seemed to slow, turn, and submerge, leaving only the spreading wake to mark its passage. When the filming stopped, Dinsdale was in a state of profound excitement mixed with disbelief. Had he actually captured proof of the monster's existence? His engineer's training made him cautious about premature conclusions, but his eyes had seen what his camera had recorded. Years later, analyst Dick Rayner would point out crucial details about Dinsdale's filming setup. The fact that the camera was positioned on the car seat and that Dinsdale was filming through his car window added an additional layer of optical interference that contributed to the footage's characteristic blur and distortion. This detail doesn't invalidate the footage, but it helps explain some of its visual characteristics. The car window acted like an additional lens element, potentially affecting focus, contrast, and clarity. For serious analysis of the film, this factor had to be taken into account. The drive back to Reading must have been one of the longest of Dinsdale's life. He had the film canisters beside him, potentially the most important footage ever shot. But he also had the burden of proof. Claims about monsters were one thing, presenting evidence was quite another. When the film was developed, Dinsdale's excitement was tempered by the realities of 1960s technology and distant photography. The object was clearly visible, clearly creating a wake, clearly moving in an unusual manner. But it was also distant, small in the frame, and lacking in fine detail. Dinsdale submitted his film to various experts for analysis. The Royal Air Force's Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Centre examined the footage and concluded that it showed, probably, an animate object of considerable size. This wasn't proof of a monster, but it was acknowledgement from serious analysts that something unusual had been captured. The film created a sensation when it was first broadcast on British television. Here, at last, was moving footage of something in Loch Ness that defied easy explanation. Dinsdale found himself thrust into the spotlight, his methodical engineer's approach lending credibility to his claims. But for Dinsdale, the 1960 film was just the beginning. He would return to Loch Ness more than 50 times over the following years, spending thousands of hours in patient observation. The Loch had claimed him, turning a respectable aeronautical engineer into Britain's most dedicated monster hunter. With each expedition, Dinsdale's knowledge grew. He learned the Loch's moods and patterns, developed theories about the creature's behaviour, and refined his surveillance techniques. He evolved from amateur enthusiast to acknowledged expert, his engineering background giving weight to his observations. Not everyone accepted Dinsdale's film as evidence of unknown animals. Skeptics proposed various alternative explanations: a boat with its engine cut, swimming deer, floating debris, even deliberate hoax. Each theory had to be examined and either refuted or acknowledged as possible. Later analysis would suggest that the object's movement pattern was consistent with a boat moving at moderate speed. The lack of visible superstructure could be explained by distance and lighting conditions. The apparent submergence might have been the boat moving into shadow. Yet Dinsdale remained convinced that he had filmed something extraordinary. His engineering background made him confident in his ability to distinguish between mechanical and biological movement. He had seen boats on Loch Ness many times. This was different. Whether or not Tim Dinsdale's film shows a monster, it undoubtedly shows something important: the power of careful observation and the courage to pursue evidence wherever it leads. Dinsdale transformed himself from skeptic to believer not through wishful thinking, but through direct experience and methodical investigation. His 1960 film remains one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence in the Loch Ness mystery. Analysed, debated, enhanced, and re-examined countless times, it continues to divide opinion between those who see proof of something extraordinary and those who see the power of suggestion and wishful interpretation. Tim Dinsdale died in 1987, still convinced that large, unknown animals inhabited Loch Ness. His film may not have provided the definitive proof he hoped for, but it demonstrated something equally valuable: that serious, methodical investigation could be applied to even the most unlikely claims. In an age of digital manipulation and viral hoaxes, there's something refreshing about Dinsdale's straightforward approach: a man with a camera, patient observation, and the willingness to follow evidence wherever it led, even if it challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. The mystery of Loch Ness continues, but Tim Dinsdale's contribution to that mystery remains clear. He showed that even the most extraordinary claims deserve serious investigation, and that sometimes the journey from skeptic to believer can be captured in 60 seconds of grainy film. If you have enjoyed the Tim Dinsdale video, please would you like and subscribe to the channel. It's free and lets us know you want more. There are some links to more info about Tim and his film below this video. Until next time, thanks for watching.